My name is Sam, and for the last 6 years, I've worked as a land surveyor. It's a job that takes me to some of the most remote and untouched corners of the country, places most people only ever see on postcards or in the glossy pages of National Geographic. Last fall, my company, Bedrock Surveying, sent me and my partner, a grizzled old-timer named Gene, deep into the Gallatin National Forest in Montana. Our assignment was to survey a massive 50,000-acre tract of land that a wealthy philanthropist was considering buying and turning into a private conservation easement. It was the kind of job we lived for: clean air, challenging terrain, and a silence so profound you could practically hear the planet turning on its axis. The nearest town, a tiny unincorporated speck on the map called Garnet Peak, was a good 2-hour drive from where we planned to set up our base camp. The drive itself was a transition from the paved highways to graded county roads and finally to a barely there two-track that rattled the fillings in our teeth. Garnet Peak wasn't much more than a wide spot in the road, consisting of a gas station with a single rusty pump, a small post office, and a general store that looked like it had been standing since the days of the gold rush. When we stopped in for last-minute supplies, the man behind the counter, a leathery fellow with a face like a topographical map and eyes the color of a faded sky, gave us a piece of advice. He watched us pile jerky, propane canisters, and freeze-dried meals onto the counter, a knowing, almost pitying look on his face. He leaned forward, the old wood of the counter creaking under his elbows, and his voice was low and raspy, like stones grinding together. "You boys headed up to the Cinnabar Ridge area?" he asked, though it sounded more like a statement. We nodded. He took a slow breath and said, "It's beautiful country, no doubt. Best hunting in the state, if you ask me. But it has its ways. It's an old place." He paused, letting his words hang in the dusty air. "And if you hear the mountains humming, don't you go looking for the source. You turn round and you walk away. That's not a song for you." Gene, who had a low tolerance for what he called backwoods hokum, just grunted, pulled a worn leather wallet from his back pocket, and slapped some cash on the counter. He was a man of few words and even less patience for superstition. He'd spent 40 years tramping through every wilderness area from the Everglades to the Arctic Circle and believed the only things worth fearing were gravity, hypothermia, and the occasional grizzly sow with cubs. We'd heard variations of that kind of local folklore in a dozen different places. Every remote community had its boogeyman, a story to keep kids from wandering too far or to spook the tourists. We didn't pay it any mind. Our setup was pretty standard for a long-term field project. We had a large, heavy-duty canvas wall tent with a small wood-burning stove for a base camp, pitched in a small, sheltered meadow next to a clear, fast-running creek. From there, we'd hike out each day with our gear: a Trimble S7 total station, a pair of our 12i GPS rovers, marking lath, rebar, and our field books. The project area was a rugged parcel of raw, untamed land, a chaotic mix of dense lodgepole pine forests, steep, granite-faced ridges that scraped the clouds, and wide-open meadows that rolled like a green ocean under the vast Montana sky. For the first week, things were perfectly, beautifully normal. The work was hard, the kind of physical labor that leaves you exhausted but deeply satisfied at the end of the day. We'd wake before dawn, the air sharp and so cold it felt like a physical slap to the face. After a quick, hot breakfast of coffee and oatmeal, we'd shoulder our packs, their weight of familiar comfort, and head out, navigating by compass and GPS to our next survey point. The days were long, filled with the rhythmic beeping of the equipment, the scratching of my pen in the field book as I recorded angles and distances, and the constant, steady crunch of our boots on pine needles and loose shale. We spoke little, operating with the easy, unspoken understanding that comes from years of working together. Gene wasn't much of a talker to begin with, and I was happy to just soak in the vast, imposing beauty of it all. He was a good teacher, patient and methodical, and I'd learned more from him than any textbook could have taught me. He knew how to read the land, to see the subtle shifts in vegetation that signaled a change in the soil, to predict the weather from the color of the sky and the direction of the wind. The scale of the place was humbling. Jagged peaks, their tops already dusted with the first snow of the season, clawed at a sky so intensely blue it felt infinite. We'd often stop on a high ridge just to look out over the landscape, feeling like the only two people on the planet. The silence was the most profound part. Back in the city, there's always a background hum, a constant thrum of traffic, machinery, and humanity. Out there, the silence was an active presence, a living thing. It was so complete that a sudden gust of wind whistling through the pines, or the distant, lonely caw of a raven, felt like an earth-shattering intrusion. But even in that first idyllic week, I started to notice small things, little dissonant notes in the symphony of the wilderness. Things that were easy to dismiss at first. Sometimes I'd get that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the distinct and unnerving feeling that we were being watched. It's a common sensation in the deep woods. Your primitive, prey animal brain kicks into high alert, scanning for predators. I'd stop what I was doing, slowly turning my head, my eyes tracing the dark, impenetrable line of trees at the edge of a meadow. I never saw anything, of course. It was always just the wind playing tricks with the shadows, or a deer I'd startled into stillness. But the feeling persisted. Then there were the cairns. We started finding them deep in the woods, miles from any marked trail or path. They weren't the simple, single-stack cairns that hikers make to mark a route. These were strange, elaborate structures, almost artistic in their construction. They were always made of 3 or 4 perfectly balanced towers of flat, smooth stones, built with a precision that seemed impossible. The rocks themselves were odd. They were a type of smooth, dark basalt, almost black, that didn't seem to belong in the immediate area, which was predominantly granite and sandstone. Gene, a geologist by training before he became a surveyor, was the first to point it out. He'd stop and dismantle one of the towers, picking up a rock and turning it over in his calloused hand, a puzzled look on his face. "This stuff doesn't belong here," he'd mutter, more to himself than to me. Fluvial transport, maybe? Carried down by a glacier 10,000 years ago. He tried to explain it away, but I could see the question in his eyes. He said it was probably just the work of some eccentric backcountry enthusiast with way too much time on their hands. But their placement felt too deliberate, too consistent, like territorial markers or signposts for something we couldn't see. One evening, as the sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, a strange and sudden quiet fell over the forest around our camp. It wasn't the usual peaceful silence of twilight. This was a heavy, expectant hush. All the normal background sounds, the chirping of the crickets, the rustling of small animals in the undergrowth, the distant call of a nighthawk, just stopped. Abruptly, it was as if someone had thrown a switch and turned off the world. Gene and I both noticed it at the same time. We were sitting by the campfire, mugs of coffee cooling in our hands, and we both looked up, our eyes meeting across the flames. We just sat there, listening to the nothingness. The silence was so absolute it felt like a pressure against my eardrums. It lasted for maybe 5 minutes, a timeless, unnerving void. Then, as suddenly and inexplicably as it had stopped, the world started up again. A single cricket chirped tentatively, then another, and soon the familiar symphony of the woods returned, as if nothing had happened. "Pressure change," Gene muttered, ever the rationalist, trying to explain it away. Big weather front moving in, probably, but it felt different. It felt deliberate, like the entire forest was holding its breath. That night, sleep was a long time coming. The thin canvas walls of our tent seemed to offer no protection at all, and every snap of a twig outside made me jump. I kept thinking about what that old man in the general store had said. If you hear the mountains humming, don't you go looking for the source. It was stupid, just a local superstition. But out there, alone in the vast, dark, and suddenly silent wilderness, The rational parts of your brain start to lose their authority. Fear, primal and irrational, begins to whisper from the shadows just beyond the firelight. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, that I needed to get a grip. But as I finally drifted off to sleep, into a restless sea of anxious dreams, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that the forest was aware of us, and that it wasn't particularly happy we were there. The work was our purpose, the reason we pushed through the underbrush and scrambled over scree fields. But a sense of profound and ancient unease was slowly starting to settle over our routine, a faint but persistent dissonance in the grand, silent symphony of the Montana wilderness. The first truly unexplainable thing, the event that shattered our comfortable sense of reality, happened about 10 days into the project. We were working our way up a steep, heavily wooded hillside on the northern boundary of the parcel, a place that felt older and wilder than anywhere else we'd been. The terrain was a surveyor's nightmare, a tangled, chaotic mess of fallen logs covered in slick green moss, thorny undergrowth that snagged our clothes, and loose rock that shifted under our boots with every single step. It was slow, frustrating, and physically exhausting work. We were leapfrogging with the total station, a standard surveying process that requires one person to stay at the instrument while the other moves ahead with a prism pole to the next point. It was my turn to be on the instrument, the gun, as we called it. I had it set up on a small, relatively flat clearing, the tripod legs sunk firmly into the damp soil. Gene was about 300 yards ahead of me, deeper in the timber. I could only catch occasional glimpses of his bright orange safety vest, a small flash of man-made color in a world of greens and browns. The dense woods swallowed sound, so we were communicating with a combination of hand signals and the occasional shout. I had just locked onto his prism, the instrument emitting a satisfying series of beeps. I took my reading, scribbled the numbers down in my field book with a pencil that was getting slick with the damp air, and then looked back up through the eyepiece to confirm the shot. That's when I heard it. Or rather, I felt it first. It wasn't a noise that came through my ears in the normal way. It was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to come directly from the ground itself, traveling up through the thick soles of my boots, of my legs, and settling deep in my chest cavity. It was a deep, powerful, bassy hum, a frequency so low it was almost on the edge of human hearing. It was steady and rhythmic, like a massive, unseen engine idling somewhere deep within a mountain's core. My first rational thought was that it was some kind of geological activity, a minor tremor or a rock slide somewhere far away. But it didn't feel like an earthquake. Earthquakes are violent and chaotic. This was smooth, consistent, almost melodic in its monotony. It was a pure, clean, impossibly deep note. I pulled away from the total station, my head cocked, trying to pinpoint a source. The air was perfectly still, the branches of the surrounding pines hanging motionless. The sound, the feeling, was everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't coming from a specific direction. It was just there, a deep, pervasive thrum that made the air feel thick and heavy, like the moments before a lightning strike. A sudden, cold dread washed over me as I remembered the store clerk's warning with a chilling clarity that made the hair on my arm stand up. If you hear the mountains humming, don't you go looking for the source. My heart started to beat a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs, a counterpoint to the deep pulse coming from the earth. I raised my hand to try and signal Gene, to see if he was feeling it too, but he was already making his way back towards me, his face a mask of bewildered confusion. He stumbled into the small clearing, his breath coming in ragged puffs, his eyes wide. He wasn't looking at me, but at the ground, as if he could see the sound. "You feel that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, strained and tight. "You hear that?" I could only nod, my mouth suddenly as dry as dust. "What in the hell is it?" I finally managed to croak out. Gene, a man I had seen face down a charging moose without so much as flinching, just shook his head slowly. He was a man who had spent 4 decades in the wilderness, a man I had never seen truly rattled by anything. But he was rattled now. "I have no idea, Sam," he said, his gaze sweeping the silent, surrounding forest. "Never heard anything like it in my life. Not once." The humming continued, a constant, oppressive pressure in the air. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical sensation that invaded my whole body. My teeth ached with the vibration, and a strange, disorienting feeling of nausea began to churn in the pit of my stomach. It felt fundamentally wrong, a deep and profound violation of the natural order of things. The forest seemed to agree. Just like that night by the campfire, a profound and absolute silence had fallen. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of the wind. It was as if every living creature in the vicinity had frozen, cowering in terror, listening to that impossible sound. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, two small, insignificant figures in the vast wilderness, completely at a loss, humbled by a phenomenon we couldn't begin to explain. The rational explanations my brain scrambled for seemed flimsy and absurd in the face of the overwhelming sensory reality of the humming. There are no mines in this area, no active drilling operations, no buried power lines or pipelines, no highways for at least 50 miles. We were utterly and completely isolated. There was no man-made source for a sound like that. Then, as abruptly and mysteriously as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow even more deafening, more unnerving than the sound itself. The pressure in the air vanished, the vibration in my bones ceased, and the world rushed back in with a sudden, startling clarity. A bird, a chickadee, tentatively chirped nearby. The wind rustled the leaves. The world was normal again. Jean and I just looked at each other, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air between us. We tried to laugh it off, to regain some semblance of control by rationalizing it. "Atmospheric phenomenon," Jean said, though his voice lacked its usual gruff conviction. "Some kind of weird air pressure inversion. Maybe sound could do funny things in the mountains. Or a low-frequency seismic event." I offered, trying to sound more confident and scientific than I felt. "Something deep underground miles down. Magma chamber, maybe." We both knew we were grasping at straws. The feeling it had produced wasn't one of scientific curiosity. It was a deep, instinctual animal dread. It felt ancient, and it felt alive. We tried to get back to work, but our concentration was shattered. Every dark shadow between the trees seemed to move. Every snap of a twig made us both flinch and spin around. We kept casting nervous glances over our shoulders, half expecting to see something standing there in the trees, watching us. The rest of the afternoon was spent in a tense, jittery silence, the easy rhythm of our work gone, replaced by a nervous, hurried energy. When we got back to camp that evening, the experience hung over us like a shroud. We didn't talk about it directly, but it was there in the way we moved, the way we constantly scanned the perimeter of our camp as dusk fell. We built the fire up bigger than usual, its dancing orange light pushing back the encroaching darkness, creating a small, fragile bubble of safety in the immense blackness of the forest. I found myself thinking about that old man in the store again. His warning hadn't sounded like a folktale then, just a quaint local superstition. Now, it felt like a prophecy. We had heard the mountain hum, and though we hadn't gone looking for the source, I had the terrible, sinking feeling that the source was now aware of us. That night, sleep offered no escape. I was plagued by a recurring nightmare of being buried alive, the immense, crushing weight of the earth pressing down on me, the impenetrable darkness filled with a low, ceaseless, vibrating hum. The song was not for us, and we had listened. The humming incident left a permanent scar on our psyche. The wilderness no longer felt like a place of serene, indifferent beauty. It now felt watchful, imbued with a quiet, unsettling, and vaguely malevolent intelligence. We became jumpy, interpreting every unfamiliar sound as a potential threat. A falling pine cone would make us jump. The mournful hoot of an owl would send a chill down our spines. The easy camaraderie Jean and I shared was replaced by a tense, shared anxiety. We spoke even less than before, but our silences were no longer comfortable. They were filled with unspoken fear. The strange, three-towered cairns seemed to be more numerous now, or maybe we were just noticing them more, our senses attuned to the strangeness of the place. We'd find them in the most improbable locations, perched on narrow, inaccessible ledges or deep within thorny, impenetrable thickets where no person would logically go. Their silent, precisely balanced forms felt less like a hobbyist craft and more like territorial markers, a nonverbal communication we were not meant to understand but could feel the intent of. This is my land. You are trespassers. As if on cue, the weather began to turn, just as Jean had predicted that evening of the first great silence. A massive cold front swept down from the north, a wall of dark, bruised-looking clouds that swallowed the sun and plunged the mountains into a state of perpetual gray twilight. A cold, persistent, drizzling rain began to fall, a miserable, soul-sapping rain that soaked everything and turned the ground into a slick, treacherous mud. The temperature dropped, and a damp, bone-aching chill settled into our tent, a chill that even the wood stove couldn't seem to banish. Our work slowed to a crawl. The slick, moss-covered rocks made climbing dangerous, and the constant rain made visibility poor and handling our sensitive electronic equipment a logistical nightmare. Our sense of isolation, once a source of comfort, now felt like a trap. The 2-hour drive to Garnet Peak now seemed like an impossible journey to another planet. We were on our own. Our second major incident, the one that tore our world apart, happened during a particularly nasty stretch of this weather. We were surveying a creek bed at the bottom of a steep-sided, claustrophobic ravine. The rain had been falling for 2 days straight without a break, and the normally placid, clear-running stream was now a churning, muddy, and violent torrent. The air was thick and heavy with the smell of wet earth, decaying leaves, and the cold, clean scent of the rain itself. We were cold, miserable, and just wanted to get the day over with and retreat to the relative warmth of the tent. Jean was setting up the total station on a narrow gravel bar that was being slowly eaten away by the rising water. I was tasked with crossing the creek to set the prism on the opposite bank. The noise of the rushing water was deafening, a constant, thunderous roar that made any kind of verbal communication impossible. I had to fight my way through a dense patch of head-high willows on the other side, their wet branches whipping at my face. I finally found a suitable spot, a small patch of semi-stable ground, drove the survey point into the soft earth, and mounted the prism on its pole. As I straightened up, drenched and shivering, I scanned the other side of the ravine, looking for Jean's familiar orange vest. I couldn't see him. My first thought was that he had just ducked behind a large boulder or a tree to shield the delicate instrument from the worst of the rain. I waited, my hands growing numb with cold. A minute passed, then 2. The rain plastered my hair to my forehead and trickled down my neck, sending fresh shivers down my spine. I started to feel that now familiar prickle of deep unease. The situation just felt wrong. I cupped my hands around my mouth and shouted his name, Jean, but my voice was instantly swallowed by the roar of the creek. It was like shouting into a hurricane. A cold, hard knot of panic began to form in my stomach. I started making my way back towards the water's edge, my eyes fixed on the spot where I had last seen him, where the total station stood. When I got to the edge of the bank and could see the gravel bar clearly, my blood ran cold. The total station was there, standing on its tripod like a silent, 3-legged sentinel. But Jean was gone. His bright yellow backpack was lying on the ground next to it, and his faded, waterproof rain hat was sitting on a nearby rock, as if he'd just taken it off for a moment. But there was absolutely no sign of him. My mind raced frantically through the horrifying possibilities. Did he slip and fall in the creek? I scrambled along the bank, my eyes scanning the churning, brown water, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I saw nothing but rushing water and debris. The banks were steep and slick, but there were no obvious signs of a fall, no disturbed earth, no broken branches, no slide marks in the mud. Did a bear get him? It was grisly country, and it was possible. But there had been no sound of a struggle, no shouts, no roars, no blood, nothing at all to indicate a violent attack. It was as if he had simply been plucked from the earth and vanished into thin air. I lost it. I screamed his name over and over again, my voice raw and desperate, until I was hoarse. I plunged into the freezing, thigh-high creek, the force of the water nearly knocking me off my feet, and scrambled up the opposite bank. I ran to the total station, my eyes darting everywhere, searching for any clue, any sign. His footprints were there in the soft mud of the gravel bar, a clear set of tracks leading from the bank to the tripod. And they just stopped. There were no tracks leading away. Not into the water, not back to the bank, not into the woods. They just ended, as if he had been lifted straight up into the sky. It made no sense. It was a violation of the basic laws of physics, a detail so profoundly and fundamentally wrong that my mind couldn't fully process it. I spent the next hour in a frantic, desperate, and useless search, crashing through the underbrush on both sides of the ravine, shouting his name until my throat was raw. The rain kept falling, cold and indifferent. The forest remained silent, offering no clues, no answers. The dread in my stomach was a cold, hard, physical thing. This wasn't a simple accident. Something was terribly, cosmically wrong. I was alone, miles from anywhere, and my partner, my friend, had just disappeared without a trace from a spot less than 30 feet away from me. As the gray, dismal dusk began to settle, making the shadows deeper and the world even more menacing, I knew I had to make a decision. I couldn't keep searching in the dark. It was pointless and dangerous. I had to get back to the camp and try to use the satellite phone to call for help. The thought of returning to the empty tent, of spending the night alone out there with the knowledge of what had happened, was terrifying. But the alternative, staying out in the freezing rain all night, was a certain death sentence. The hike back to camp was the longest and most terrifying ordeal of my life. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into a menacing shape. The sound of the wind in the trees sounded like whispers, like a language I couldn't understand. I felt 1,000 unseen eyes on my back, a palpable, physical pressure. I clutched the canister of bear spray in my hand so tightly my knuckles were white, though I knew deep down that it would be useless against whatever was out here. I kept thinking about Jean's footprints, how they just ended. It was an impossible, maddening detail, a piece of a puzzle from a reality that wasn't my own. When I finally stumbled into the clearing where our tent was pitched, a new wave of horror washed over me, so intense it almost brought me to my knees. The flap of the tent, which we always kept meticulously zipped shut against the rain and the insects, was wide open, flapping gently and mockingly in the breeze. The interior was a complete wreck. Our sleeping bags had been torn to shreds, the synthetic stuffing thrown all over the small space like a bizarre snowstorm. Our carefully organized food supplies were scattered across the floor, but almost nothing was actually eaten. Cans were dented and punctured, bags of rice and pasta were ripped open, but the contents were just left in a messy pile on the floor. It wasn't the work of a bear. I had seen bear damage before. A bear would have gorged itself. It would have licked every last calorie out of every container. This was different. It was an act of pure, calculated vandalism. It was violent, chaotic, but also methodical. It was an act of rage. And then I saw it, and the last vestiges of my rational world crumbled into dust. Scrawled on the inside canvas of the tent, in the thick, dark, viscous mud from the creek bed, was a single, massive symbol. It wasn't a letter or a number from any language I had ever seen. It was a spiral, drawn with a strange, shaky, and yet deliberate precision. And in the very center of the spiral was a mark that looked chillingly, unmistakably like a stylized eye. The symbol was at least 3 feet across, dominating the small space with its silent, malevolent presence. It felt ancient, powerful, and it was a clear and unambiguous message. You are not welcome here. You're being watched. I can touch you whenever I want. My satellite phone, our only link to the outside world, our last hope, was lying on the floor beneath the symbol. It had been smashed to pieces, ground into the dirt floor with what must have been incredible force. The screen was a spiderweb of cracks. The antenna snapped off. My last hope of calling for help was gone. I was completely, utterly alone, cut off from the entire human race, with a storm raging outside and the certain knowledge that something was out there in the woods with me. Something that had taken Jean and had now destroyed our camp as a final, contemptuous gesture. The store clerk's words echoed in my head, a frantic, looping mantra of pure terror. That's not a song for you. The mountain had hummed, and we hadn't listened. Now it was showing us the consequences. The night after Jean disappeared was not just a night. It was a descent into a specific and profound kind of hell. It was 14 hours of the purest, most undiluted form of terror I have ever known. I didn't even try to sleep. The very idea was a laughable absurdity. I barricaded myself inside the ruined tent, piling our broken supply boxes, camp chairs, and scattered gear against the torn flap, creating a flimsy, pathetic barrier against the vast, menacing darkness outside. I sat in the pitch black, my back pressed against the cold, damp canvas wall where that horrifying symbol was drawn, clutching a small hand axe we used for splitting firewood. The wooden handle was slick with my sweat. My body was racked with violent, adrenaline-fueled tremors, and my ears strained to catch any sound over the relentless drumming of the rain on the canvas and the mournful howling of the wind through the pines. The forest, which had once seemed so peaceful and majestic, was now a source of relentless, intelligent menace. Every creak of a tree branch groaning under the weight of the wind, every rustle of leaves, sent a fresh jolt of pure, ice-cold fear through my system. I imagined shapes moving in the darkness just beyond the thin canvas walls, silent and patient predators. I thought about Jean, about his footprints just ending in the mud. The sheer, logical impossibility of it was what scared me the most. This wasn't an animal. Animals leave tracks. They are bound by the same physical laws as we are. This wasn't a person. What person could do that? It was something else, something that operated by a set of ancient and terrifying rules I couldn't begin to comprehend. Sometime around what must have been 3 or 4 in the morning, in the deepest, darkest, and coldest part of the night, a new sound began. It was a soft, wet, scraping noise from right outside the tent. It was slow and deliberate. Scrape, drag, pause, scrape, drag, pause. It sounded like something heavy and rough, something with the texture of a waterlogged log covered in bark, being purposefully pulled across the muddy ground. It circled the tent once, then twice, the sound moving around me, a predator sizing up its cage. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. I held my breath, pressing myself flatter against the canvas, praying it wouldn't find the opening I had blocked. Then a smell hit me, seeping through the canvas. It was the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. But underneath, it was something else, something acrid and faintly metallic like old blood or rust. The scraping stopped directly behind me, on the other side of the canvas where the spiral was drawn. There was a long, terrible, expectant silence. I could feel a presence there, a weight and a profound coldness that seemed to leach through the fabric and touch my skin. I could feel its attention focused on me. Then came a sound, a series of sounds that will be burned into my auditory memory until the day I die. It was a soft, wet, popping noise like a blister bursting, followed by thick, guttural, and rapid clicking. It was a biological sound, but not one that belonged to any animal I knew. It was the sound of something utterly, horrifyingly alien. I squeezed my eyes shut so tightly I saw spots, tears of pure terror streaming down my face. I was convinced it was going to tear through the canvas, and that would be the end. But after a few agonizing, eternal minutes, the scraping sound resumed, slowly moving away from the tent, its rhythm unchanged, until it faded back into the cacophony of the storm. It was toying with me. It wanted me to know it was there. I stayed awake like that, rigid with fear, until the first weak, gray light of dawn began to filter through the trees. When the world outside was no longer pitch black, I cautiously, slowly moved the barricade and peered outside. The world was a mess of mud and rain-soaked leaves, and all around the tent, in the soft earth, was a single continuous track. It wasn't a footprint. It looked as if a massive, heavily laden sack, something with the texture of rough burlap or gnarled bark, had been dragged in a perfect, unbroken circle around my tent. There were no paw prints, no boot prints, just this one bizarre, circular furrow in the mud. I knew I couldn't stay. To remain at the camp was to wait for death. My only chance, my only slim hope of survival, was to hike out. It was a terrifying prospect, a 20-mile trek through rugged, unfamiliar terrain in the middle of a storm, with something monstrous and intelligent hunting in the woods. But it was my only option. I grabbed what little gear was salvageable: a compass, a knife, a waterproof case with a few matches, and a half-eaten bag of trail mix. I left everything else behind. I didn't even glance back at the ruined tent and the symbol drawn on its wall as I plunged into the forest, heading south, towards where I prayed the old logging road was. The next 2 days were a continuous, waking nightmare, a blur of misery, exhaustion, and constant, gnawing fear. The rain never let up, and the temperature continued to drop. I was soaked to the bone within minutes, and my body ached with a deep, penetrating cold that I felt in my marrow. I moved as fast as I could, stumbling through the mud, pushing through dense, wet undergrowth that tore at my clothes and skin, my eyes constantly scanning the trees around me, my head on a perpetual swivel. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague premonition. It was a crushing certainty. I never saw anything clearly, but I felt it. It was a pressure on the back of my neck, a flicker of movement at the very edge of my vision that was gone the instant I turned to look. During that trek, the strangeness of the forest intensified. The evidence of the thing's presence was everywhere. I began to find trees with bizarre markings. Long, vertical strips of bark had been peeled away from the base of the tree to as high as 10 or 12 feet up, far higher than a bear could reach. The exposed wood beneath was covered in a strange, slimy, dark red residue that smelled faintly of copper and rot. It looked like something huge had shimmied its way up the trunks, scraping the bark off as it went. On some of the trees, I found the same spiral and eye symbol from the tent, gouged deep into the living wood, the cuts fresh and weeping sap. The sounds of the forest were wrong, too. The normal sounds were gone, replaced by an unsettling and unnatural soundtrack. I would hear noises that I couldn't identify, the wet clicking and popping I'd heard outside my tent, and a strange, high-pitched, almost insect-like chittering that seemed to come from high up in the canopy, even though there were no squirrels or birds in sight. Worst of all, though, was the silence. The forest would suddenly go completely, deathly quiet, just as it had before the humming. It was an unnatural, oppressive void of sound, and I came to learn that it meant that it was close. During those periods of intense silence, I would freeze, diving for cover behind a tree or in a thicket, my heart hammering against my ribs, and wait, holding my breath for the world to start making noise again. Late on the second day, driven by a hunger so intense it was making me dizzy, I stumbled upon a small, circular clearing. In the very center of the clearing stood a single, massive ponderosa pine, its trunk thick and gnarled with age. And at the base of the pine, there was a gruesome, ritualistic-looking display that stopped me dead in my tracks. A deer, a large buck, had been killed, but hadn't been eaten. It had been arranged. Its body was contorted into an impossible, nightmarish shape, its limbs twisted and broken with incredible force to form a grotesque mimicry of a seated human figure. Its head was bent forward as if in prayer, and its antlers had been adorned with macabre, carefully placed decorations, strips of its own hide, woven together with pine branches and the bright, iridescent blue and black feathers of a Steller's jay. It was a grotesque work of art, a horrifying effigy. The area around it, a circle of about 20 feet, was completely devoid of tracks. Not a single print, not even from the deer itself. I backed away slowly, the trail mix I was about to eat turning to ash in my mouth. This was not the work of any known predator. This was an act of intelligent, creative, and profoundly malevolent artistry. It was a display. It was a warning. And I had the sickening, soul-crushing feeling that it was meant for me. It was a message that I was in its territory, that it was toying with me, and that it could do this to me whenever it chose. My frantic escape turned into a full-blown, panicked flight. I abandoned all caution, all sense of direction, running blindly through the woods, branches whipping at my face and arms, my lungs burning as I sobbed for breath. I just had to get out. Sometime later, I don't know how long, my foot caught on a moss-covered rock, and I went down hard, my head cracking against a stone with a sickening, wet thud. The world swam in a nauseating swirl of green and gray, my vision filled with black spots, and then there was nothing at all. Curiosity, a stupid and dangerous impulse born of desperation, momentarily overrode my fear. I pushed to the spot again. A section of moss-covered earth and tangled roots gave way with a soft, crumbling sound, falling inward and revealing a dark, black opening behind it. It was a cave. Not a large one, just a narrow, vertical fissure in a rock, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. A blast of cold, stale air, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, something deeply unpleasant and powerfully organic, washed over me. It smelled like a butcher's shop that had been abandoned for weeks, a thick, cloying stench of rot and decay. My first instinct, my only rational instinct, was to run. Every alarm bell in my head was screaming at me to get away from that place, to climb out of the gully and never look back. But then a different, more desperate thought took hold. I was lost, injured, and being actively hunted by something unimaginable. The forest was its territory, but maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't follow me underground. A cave offered shelter from elements. It was a place to hide, to rest, to wait until I had the strength to move again. It was a terrible, desperate gamble, but at that moment, it felt like my only one. Taking a deep, shuddering breath of the foul air, I squeezed my way through the narrow opening. The darkness inside was absolute, a thick, palpable blackness that seemed to swallow the faint gray light from the entrance hole. The air was frigid, stagnant, and utterly still. I fumbled in my pocket for my waterproof match case. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 agonizing tries to strike one. The match flared to life, a tiny, sputtering, courageous star in the immense, oppressive darkness. And I saw the walls. My brain simply refused to process what I was seeing. It was a sensory overload of pure, undiluted, reality-shattering horror. The walls of the cave weren't rock. They were a wet, glistening, pulsating organic surface, a living tapestry of mottled, gray and purple tissue that seemed to stretch away into the infinite darkness. The walls were covered completely and utterly covered in eyes. They were not human eyes. They were 1,000 different shapes and sizes, a biological nightmare. Some were small and black and clustered together in grotesque, insectoid patterns, like the eyes of a spider. Others were huge, round, and luminous, with vertical slit pupils like a cat's, and they glowed with a faint, internal, sickly green phosphorescence in the match light. There were eyes on short, fleshy stalks that swiveled independently to follow the tiny flame, and huge, multifaceted compound eyes that shimmered with 1,000 tiny, identical images of my terrified face. They were yellow, blood red, emerald green, and a milky, blind-looking white. And they were all looking at me. They were all focused on me. As the match burned down, the flame licking at my numb fingertips, I saw that they were blinking. Not in unison, but in a sickening, random, rippling wave that flowed across the fleshy walls. A wet, sticky, tearing sound, like Velcro being pulled apart with agonizing slowness, accompanied each slow, deliberate blink. The fleshy walls around them pulsed with a slow, steady, rhythmic beat, like a giant, slumbering heart. The cave was not a cave. It was a creature, or, terrifyingly, just a small part of one. I was standing inside a living organism. The match went out, plunging me back into absolute, terrifying darkness. But the image was burned onto the inside of my eyelids. The thousands of staring, blinking, watching eyes. I scrambled for another match, my fingers fumbling with the case, dropping one into the darkness. The sound of my own ragged, panicked breathing was unnaturally loud in the dead silence. The wet, organic smell was overwhelming now, a cloying stench of rot and strange, alien biology that coated the back of my throat. I got another match lit. I had to get out. I had to get out now. I turned back towards the entrance, a small patch of comforting gray light that seemed 1,000,000 miles away. But something was blocking it. A shape was unfolding itself in the darkness near the mouth of the cave, a mass of living shadows that seemed to be pulling itself together from the very walls. The sound started again, that same low, resonant, bone-jarring humming. But it wasn't coming from the mountain anymore. It was coming from the walls, all around me. The entire creature was vibrating with the sound, and it was getting louder, rising in pitch and intensity until it was a physical pressure against my body. The floor beneath my feet, also made of that soft, yielding, fleshy substance, began to tremble violently. My wavering matchlight fell on the thing that was blocking the entrance. It wasn't solid. It was a flowing, amorphous, protoplasmic mass of the same eye-covered flesh from walls. A pseudopod, a limb, an appendage of the massive creature I was inside, sent to deal with the infection. It flowed like thick, black tar, coalescing into a vaguely humanoid shape, but one that was constantly shifting and reforming, its surface bubbling and churning. More eyes opened on its surface, all of them fixing on me. In the center of what I perceived as its head, a vertical lipless slit opened, a mouth that issued a low, guttural clicking sound, the same sound I had heard outside my tent. It was the thing that had dragged itself around my tent. It was the thing that had taken Jean. I was frozen, completely paralyzed by a terror so profound it felt like my soul was trying to claw its way out of my body. The match went out. I was trapped in the dark with it. The humming grew to a deafening, painful roar that vibrated through my bones, and I could hear the wet, sliding, slithering sound of the creature moving towards me through the blackness. When I came to, the rain had finally stopped. The world was unnervingly quiet, and the air was thick with a clean, earthy smell of petrichor. A dull, persistent ache throbbed in my head, and the world seemed to tilt when I moved. I was lying at the bottom of a small, steep-sided gully, my body a collection of aches and pains. I sat up, my muscles screaming in protest. A wave of dizziness and nausea washed over me, but I fought it back. I had to keep moving. As I pushed myself to my feet, leaning heavily against the damp, mossy wall of the gully for support, my hand slipped. The section of wall I had been leaning on wasn't solid rock. It was loose earth and roots. Something primal, something deep and ancient inside me, snapped. The survival instinct buried under layers of shock and abject terror finally broke free. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just reacted. I threw myself to the side, scrambling away from the entrance along the pulsating wall. My hands brushed against the eyes, and they felt slick and rubbery, like hard-boiled eggs, retracting from my touch with a wet, popping sound. A wave of nausea, so strong, I almost blacked out, washed over me. I lit another match, my last one. The creature was between me and the exit, its formless body blocking the only way out. It was slow, ponderous, but it was relentless. It was hurting me, pushing me deeper into the cave, deeper into the gullet of the beast. Panic gave me a burst of desperate, insane strength. I wasn't going to die in here. I wasn't going to be slowly digested by this thing. I looked at the creature, a nightmare-given form, then at the narrow gap between its shifting body and the cave wall. There was maybe a foot of space. It was a suicidal idea. It was my only idea. The match burned my fingers again. I didn't care. As its light died, I took a deep breath of the foul, fetid air and I ran. I charged headlong into the darkness, aiming for that tiny gap. I collided with the creature's body. It was like running into a wall of cold, wet, yielding clay. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and the stench was suffocating. I felt dozens of those slick, horrible eyes press against my face and arms, their lids fluttering against my skin. A high-pitched shriek of pure, animal revulsion tore from my throat. I pushed, clawed, and scrambled, my feet slipping and sliding on the fleshy, wet floor. The creature seemed to react with surprise, its humming faltering for just a second. Its body tried to close around me, to engulf and absorb me, but I was already squirming through the gap. I felt a searing, white-hot pain in my leg as some part of it latched on, a sharp, piercing agony like 3 sharp spikes being driven into my calf. But I was almost through. I burst past it and lunged for the light. I scrambled through the narrow opening of the cave, tearing my clothes and skin on the sharp rocks and tangled roots, and tumbled back out into the gully, back into the real world. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't dare. I just ran. I ignored the screaming pain in my leg, the blinding throbbing in my head, the crushing exhaustion that was threatening to overwhelm me. I just ran, fueled by a surge of pure, animal terror that burned brighter than any pain. I ran until my lungs felt like they were on fire and my legs were made of jelly. I ran until the gully was far behind me. I ran until I finally burst out of the tree line and onto the blessed, beautiful gravel of an old, overgrown logging road. I had never been so happy to see a sign of human civilization in my entire life. I didn't know where it led, but it didn't matter. It led away from that cave, away from those eyes. I stumbled down that road for what felt like hours, my mind a complete, merciful blank, focused only on the simple mechanical act of putting one foot in front of the other. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, spooky shadows across the road, when I finally heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the sound of an internal combustion engine. An old, beat-up Ford pickup truck came rattling around a bend. The driver, a hunter in full camo on his way out of the forest, took one look at my torn, blood and mud-caked clothes, my wild, terrified eyes, and the blood streaming from the wound on my leg, and slammed on his brakes. He helped me into his truck without asking too many questions at first. I think he could see that I was in a profound state of shock. I just kept muttering the same thing over and over again, like a prayer or a mantra. The eyes. The walls were covered in eyes. He gave me a bottle of water and a blanket from the back of his truck. He drove me to the nearest town, which wasn't Garnet Peak, but a slightly larger one to the south. He dropped me off at the small rural hospital, wished me luck, and drove away, probably eager to forget he'd ever laid eyes on the raving lunatic he'd picked up on that lonely road. The doctors and the sheriff who interviewed me over the next few days were skeptical, to say the least. I tried to tell them the whole story. I told them about Jean disappearing from beside the creek, about the humming sound, about our destroyed camp, and the symbol about the cave. I know how I must have sounded, like a man suffering from exposure, a severe concussion, and profound psychological trauma. The official story, the one that went in the reports, was that Gene and I were caught in a sudden storm. He was likely swept away by the flash-flooded creek, a tragic accident. I, in my grief and confusion, had fallen and hit my head, becoming delirious and hallucinating the rest of the bizarre tale. They mounted a search and rescue operation for Gene. They were out there for a full week. They found our base camp, or what was left of it. They noted in their report that the damage was consistent with a highly agitated and destructive black bear. They found the total station by the creek. They never found a single trace of Gene. Not a button from his coat, not a thread from his pack, not a single bone. He had simply vanished. They did find his footprints in the mud that led to the instrument, and then just stopped. The sheriff called it a puzzling detail, but attributed it to the rain and rising water washing the rest of the tracks away. The wound on my leg was the strangest part, the one piece of physical evidence they couldn't explain away. The doctors couldn't identify what had caused it. It was 3 deep, parallel puncture wounds, almost like a bite from something with 3 large teeth, but not from any animal they recognized. The tissue around the wound was severely infected and necrotic, and it took 2 surgeries and a heavy, month-long course of powerful antibiotics to stop the infection from spreading and save my leg. I still have the scars. 3 pale, puckered, circular marks on my calf that ache with a deep, cold pain whenever a storm is coming. I never went back to work as a surveyor. I couldn't. The thought of being alone in the wilderness, of hearing the wind in the trees, fills me with a cold, paralyzing dread that makes it hard to breathe. I moved to a city in the Midwest, Chicago, as far from any mountains as I could get. I work a desk job now, in accounting. It's boring, but it's safe. I need to be surrounded by people, by concrete and steel, by the constant, meaningless noise of civilization. It's the only way I can drown out the memory of that absolute, watchful silence. Sometimes at night, when the city is quiet, when the traffic dies down, I think I can still feel it. A low, phantom vibration in the floorboards of my apartment. I know it's just my imagination, a neurological scar left on my mind by the trauma. But I can't shake the feeling that the thing in the mountain is still there, slumbering in the dark. I think about the sheer, unimaginable scale of it. The cave wasn't the creature. It was just a tiny part of it, like a single pore on the skin of something unimaginably vast, something that is intertwined with the rock and roots of the entire mountain range. A few years ago, out of some morbid, self-destructive curiosity, I looked up Garnet Peak online. I found a local history forum where people were sharing old stories and folklore passed down through the generations. One post caught my eye and made my blood run cold. It was from an old man whose great-grandfather had been one of the first prospectors in the area back in the 1800s. He told a story about how the native tribes that once lived there, the Shoshone and the Salish, considered that whole section of the Gallatin Range to be sacred and forbidden ground. They called it the place where the mountain god sleeps. They said the mountain was alive, that it dreamed, and that its dreams could swallow men whole, leaving no trace behind. The post ended with a warning, a phrase his great-grandfather had learned from the tribe's shaman, passed down to him and now to me across the decades, a chilling, perfect echo of the same advice I'd received in that dusty old store. It said, "If you hear the mountains humming, don't you go looking for the source. That's not a song for you." They were right. We should have listened. We should have turned around and walked away. Because now I know what that song is. It's the sound of something ancient and vast waking from its slumber. And I know, with a certainty that haunts my every waking moment, that it's still out there, in the deep, dark, and silent places of the world, dreaming its terrible dreams. And it is watching. It is always, always watching.